From the studios of Blackwater Media in the city of Atlanta, it is time for another edition of the Dr. William Lester Show, and I want to thank everyone who has chosen to partake in this adventure, this exploration of the cool vintage lifestyle. It is the only lifestyle for me, and I hope the same is true for you as well. In any event, we will have a great deal of fun and enjoyment exploring those things, those different aspects of life, whether it be fashion or film or food or music or every other element of life that brings delight, entertainment, joy, and pleasure. We'll explore all of those things from the vantage point of being cool and being vintage. I want to remind everyone who doesn't already know that the show can be heard on our Blackwater Media YouTube channel. It can be heard on my personal Facebook page, which is just William Lester, and it can also be heard on the William Lester Show Facebook page. So many ways to listen. In addition, you can hear the show on Google Plus as well. I have already started with a nice pipe bowl full of Deep Hollow, which I talked about on an earlier show. I've already started that, and I have paired that with just a little Cutty Sark and soda, little club soda. It's, a classic vintage combination, scotch and soda. A favorite of many ladies and gentlemen down through the ages. So I posted on the show page a little graphic announcing the Cool Vintage Halloween Movie Film Festival for this year. And if you've gone up there to see it, you know it's a nice little collage of imagery from great classic horror and fantasy films of a vintage nature, of a cool vintage nature. So if you haven't seen it, go up there and check it out. It's the William Lester Show Facebook page. And it's just something I put together in conjunction to what we've been talking about. And as I think I might have said it on an earlier show, that I will let you guys know on this show what films I will be screening. And I will be sharing these films with guests, because watching them on your own is fine and it's enjoyable, and those are good moments. But being able to extend the enjoyment to your comrades, to your colleagues, to your friends, to your acquaintances, have guests over to screen these films, and of course that leads to the other great areas of cool vintage lifestyle to be explored, i.e. food and drink, or the enjoyment of some great cigars. So it's definitely something to be shared. But we're going to continue the trend from the last couple of shows, and the film I have chosen to talk about tonight is just a whole lot of fun, and it certainly fits within the context of cool vintage horror. I'm going to take you back to the year 1972, and I'm going to also take you into an era in which a filmmaking genre came to the fore that was called blaxploitation. And of course, it was almost inevitable that this would happen, where you kind of had a post-civil rights movement inclusion of some African Americans in the Hollywood infrastructure, where films with majority black casts literally became in vogue. And oftentimes these films would have a pandering quality, sometimes offensive, but not always. And this particular film I'm referring to tonight is a hybrid of blaxploitation and cool vintage horror. And the film is called Blacula. And this is just one of those films that's kind of been floating out there for more than 40 years now. And it's been on the radar, then off the radar, then on the radar. And as I looked a few pieces of information up about the film for the show, I did discover that it is on a Blu-ray. Of course, it's been on DVD for a few years because I've owned it for a number of years, but I know we have a lot of Blu-ray devotees out there. And if you decide to pick this up, which I'm going to go ahead and recommend that you do, it is available in the Blu-ray format. So let me go down in the list of the cast first, so that we can just kind of lay the proper foundation. Again, this movie is entitled Blacula, 1972, American International Pictures. And the main character, the vampire, is played by the outstanding William Marshall, who was a wonderful actor. A lot of science fiction fans know him for his role in a 1967 episode of Star Trek in which he played Dr. Richard Daystrom, the creator of the M5 computer. A standout episode. But he was a marvelous actor, classically trained, and so he plays the vampire Blacula. Vanetta McGee, who plays his wife / later love interest, and I'll explain that. Denise Nichols, Thalmus Razulala, Dr. Gordon Thomas is the character that he plays. Charles Macaulay plays Dracula himself. G2 Kumbuka, who was one of those actors who, I saw him, as a child, I saw him on TV all the time. I saw him in a lot of different things. I had no idea what his name was. But it seems like in the 70s he was everywhere. And Elisha Cook Jr., who was another one of those very recognizable character actors. And he was just one of scores of actors that as a youngster I saw on television and in films all the time. I was very familiar with his face and had absolutely no idea what his name was. But that's the major portion of the cast that we should be concerned with. So I'm going to go ahead and relight, because I actually got started before I began the show. So again, we've got the Deep Hollow and the Diamond Match, and we begin lighting and puffing. And it's no surprise that it's absolutely fantastic. And we take a sip of our Cutty Sark and our Canada Dry Club Soda, and all is right with the world. So the film opens appropriately in the year 1780, Castle Dracula. And William Marshall at this point, this early point, is portraying a noble African prince named Mumawalde. And he is accompanied by his wife, Queen Luva. And they have come to Transylvania because they regard Prince Vlad, Count Dracula, as an influential statesman. And the reason they've come to him is because they're traveling across Europe, petitioning notable heads of state to begin the process of ceasing the African slave trade. And Dracula really finds this amusing. And by the way, in the film, I referenced it just a second ago, Dracula is played very adeptly by Charles Macaulay. But he finds it amusing and suggests that for an individual of his stature, that the institution of slavery is a perfectly normal and acceptable way of life. There's nothing wrong with it in his view. And again, as I've said in the past in the discussion of other films, there are certain parts I'm going to leave out, to maximize your enjoyment when you watch it. But there's a few things that Dracula says in this back and forth that is very insulting to Mumawalde. And it leads to an argument, and it leads to a physical confrontation. Now, bear in mind, the prince and his wife have no idea that Dracula is a vampire until things get out of hand. Prince Mumawalde is subdued and bitten by Dracula. And then the prince and his wife are taken down to what is probably the last place anybody would ever want to be, Dracula's dungeon. And Prince Mumawalde is sealed in a coffin with chains and irons and everything. And before Dracula closes the lid, he places a curse on him. Of course, being bitten, he will return as a vampire. And it's at that time that Dracula curses Prince Mumawalde with his own name, and he said, "You shall be called Blacula, the vampire." And he seals the coffin. Mumawalde's wife, Queen Luva, is left there in the dungeon at the side of the coffin that her husband is entombed in. And Dracula says, "You will remain here until your death," and quote, "and until the black flesh rots from your bones." And Dracula and his minions seal them in. And that's how it starts. And of course, you have to have this incredible flash forward to modern times, at that time 1972, and there are antique dealers or fortune hunters, treasure hunters, who have come to Dracula's castle to buy certain things for buying and selling, buy low, sell high, and they buy a lot of artifacts from the castle, including this coffin in the dungeon, of course, which they have no idea of what's happened. They have no idea of the history and the horror of what's unfolded. So basically, through that process, Blacula and his coffin are brought to America unknowingly. And it's very easy to understand that there will be a terror and horror and out of control murderous activity soon to follow. And Blacula, Prince Mumawalde, of course, rises And bear in mind, he's been encased in this coffin since 1780. And he is thirsting for blood. And he begins his nightly feeding, savaging his victims, and spreading the cult of vampirism, of course. And as is always the case, these unexplained deaths catch the attention of the police. Now, of course, there's no police who are saying, "Oh, this is clearly a vampire, so let's go after that." But these things are happening, and it catches the attention of Dr. Gordon Thomas, who was played by Thalmus Rasulala. I'm going to try to say his name correctly. Rasulala. Right. Thalmus Rasulala. And he is this real bright, sharp detective, doctor. And it's kind of nebulous in the film. Because is he a policeman? Is he a doctor? Well, he's clearly a doctor because they call him Dr. Thomas in the film. But he's always in and around the company of the police. So there's a relationship there. So he carries some weight. He carries some authority, which is kind of, portrayed in the film. And the more he finds out, the more he becomes unsettled by what's going on. This is not normal. This is weird. There's some things here that I can't explain. And he has a girlfriend named Michelle, who's played by Denise Nicholas. And Michelle's sister, Tina, played by Vanetta McGee, just so happens to be the spitting image of Queen Luva, the long dead wife of Prince Mamuwalde. So when Blacula lays eyes on her, what do you think his agenda is going to be? Because in his mind, she has returned to him from the grave across the centuries to rejoin him. And so there's a great deal of interplay between these people in social settings. Dr. Thomas, Tina, Michelle, Blacula, and there's a whole interplay where the vampire is trying to make inroads into this circle of friends and acquaintances. And of course, because he is the charming, handsome, well put together man of the world, cultured, intelligent, well, Tina is captivated by all of this. And you can tell that she is being wooed by his charms. And so you have this constant element of him kind of bringing her into his web. And of course, at some point, he reveals his true nature to her. But on another track of the story, he's still out killing and drinking blood regularly. So there's this wonderful kind of cyclone of storylines and subplots going on. G2 Kumbuka, who, like I said, was everywhere in the 70s, plays a character who was kind of that clever, cool soul brother type that was portrayed or written into these movies quite frequently. And it wasn't offensive. It wasn't insulting. But it was kind of a reflection of the times. He was always stylishly dressed, stylistically for that time, and he always said the right things. He was always a ladies' man, and he was very cool and is very debonair. But the character he plays is called Skillet, and so he's kind of, and he's a little humorous. So he injects some humor into the film. And Elisha Cook Jr., great character actor, who, by the way, he's the second Star Trek connection, because in the Star Trek episode Court Martialed, he plays the attorney for Captain Kirk, Cogley, I think was the character name there. And again, just one of those faces that I saw all the while growing up. Saw his face everywhere. TV movies. Had no idea what his name was. But he's in the movie, and he basically plays an attendant or some kind of custodian or assistant at the city morgue. So you see, you have a wonderful little melee of activity going here. And basically, Blacula has decided that he is going to commit his rebirth, his resurrection through vampirism to rejoining or having his reincarnated Queen Luva in the form of Tina to join him. And so not only does it turn into a race to stop this vampiric monster from stalking the city streets at night, it also becomes a race to save Tina, who he sees as, again, his long lost love. And although we know he's a monster, we know he's a killer, we know he is an undead, we know he has to be stopped, but we also know his history. We also know that this was something that befell him through no fault of his own. So he is, to a degree, a sympathetic character. He had gone to Europe to protest and to try and stop the slave trade. So we know that he has certain characteristics of nobility. He was already a great leader among his own people. So there is a part of the viewer who will want to have some sympathy for him, or at least identify with his plight, his struggle, his curse, as it were. But when you pull back, the bottom line is he's a bloodthirsty vampire. He has to be stopped. Now, William Marshall was a large man. I believe he was 6'5". So you can imagine in the film, he has an overbearing, imposing constitution. So it was very easy to portray him in this manner. And in the film, I mean, he demonstrates his power, his strength, his agility. There's not a man alive who could oppose him in a hand-to-hand situation. Obviously, as a vampire, you could not destroy him with bullets. So one of the cool things is that he is an imposing, formidable figure to have to deal with. And he has this wonderful voice. Now, of course, in the film, there are moments when he has, his normal William Marshall speaking voice, which depicts a very erudite, articulate. But when he goes into his monster mode, when he goes full vamp, he uses that powerful voice and he rages and roars in furious contempt. There are a couple of wonderful musical sequences in the film. And by musical sequences, all I mean is there are a couple of scenes where a lot of these characters kind of gather at this nightclub. And there's a singing group and a band in the nightclub. The singing group is called Hughes Corporation. And they sing a few songs in the film, which are very cool. Certainly emblematic of that era, but very good, very listenable. When you see the film, you'll understand what I mean, and you'll immediately go somewhere and see if you can find and download those songs. Yes, you can. You might even find the soundtrack album to this film, because there are some other cuts that are absolutely worth having as part of your music collection. So you see, this movie offers up quite a bit all the way around. There are excellent kind of chase / fight scenes between the vampire and the vampire's minions and the police. And the police are shooting these vampires and not being able to figure out why they're not dying, and all of these things, and the vampires are trying to bite the police, and there's these great fight sequences. And again, I said before on another show how when you watch these films, you understand them in the context of the time that they were made. And this holds true here. It's 1972, there's no CGI. So, I mean, things were done, what they call in camera. So the only off-camera or out-of-camera thing that happens in the film is that Blacula can turn into a bat. And so there's some really cool, clever animation work there. But that's once or twice. But everything else is done physically in camera. And so when you watch the film, there's a great deal of stunt work, clearly, with all of the fighting and tossing and falling and rolling around and running around. And the special effects are mostly in the form of the makeup and the prosthetics, which in my view, again, admittedly from the perspective of a connoisseur of the cool vintage horror film, in my view, they're fantastic. And they're creepy, which is what we want here. So it all works. Now, in the film, the Thalmus Rasulala character, Dr. Thomas, is basically the Van Helsing equivalent. He is Blacula's main foe. He's the guy who's got to get the vampire. And there is an interesting back and forth between them in the film. I mean, they're literally sitting there going back and forth, talking with each other. And they both kind of know. They both kind of know that the other is a worthy adversary. And so they have this back and forth, or they're dick swinging, which is something that we reference that with respect to the in the Death Moon film. But it's the same thing. It's obvious that that's what they're doing. You want to try to get me, I want to try to get you, and we'll see who wins. But I'm not going to tell you who wins on this show because I want you to watch the film. So let's go through some of the fine points. Blacula, 1972, American International Pictures, William Marshall, Vanetta McGee, Denise Nicholas, Thalmus Rasulala, Charles Macaulay, G2 Kumbuka, and Elijah Cook Jr. are the main characters. Fun, creepy, and most importantly, cool and vintage. This would be an excellent addition to your cool vintage horror film Halloween film festival. Seal of approval. DVD, Blu-ray, stream it somewhere, but this is a thumbs up. Now, how do you listen to the show? Well, if you're hearing my voice, you've already figured that out. But this is for the benefit of people hearing it for the first time and needing a little roadmap on what to do. YouTube, we have the Blackwater Media channel. We have the William Lester Facebook page, which is my personal page, where every day it's cool vintage stuff. So if you've been there, you already know how that works. And you have the William Lester Show Facebook page, which is almost like a mirror image of my personal Facebook page, because a lot of the postings are very similar. But this is a page that is, dedicated to the show, so that the show has its own independent Facebook presence. And you can also hear the show on Google+. I want to thank a number of people who have provided commentary on how much they enjoy the program. And I want to encourage that to continue and increase. When you go to the Blackwater Media YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe. So you take away the guesswork here. Just subscribe, and when a new episode comes out, you'll be notified just like that. Take all the guesswork out. If you follow me on Facebook, you already know the routine and you're not going to have any issues. But I would like you guys to subscribe to the YouTube channel Blackwater Media and leave me your commentary, leave me your thoughts, your reflections, your insights, and most of all your memories because that's what we do here. We're dedicated to the cool vintage lifestyle. So we're going to stop it there. We've done another show, and I've had a lot of fun doing it. Great conversation about great, cool, vintage living. You know, we're coming into the fall. I did a little fashion shopping recently, because, you know, for that reason, fall's coming. And I was mesmerized and struck, you know, happily, of course, at the selection. I mean, basically, it was cool vintage stuff without people calling it cool vintage stuff. And so if you are into that lifestyle, or if you are starting to adopt the cool vintage lifestyle, you should absolutely let the inclusion of new clothing in your fall wardrobe be part of that. You should absolutely do it. I started posting some cool vintage fashion examples on the show page. I will continue to do so. I'm kind of selective about which ones I want to, you know, post and portray, because I want to convey, you know, a kind of precise, specific motif. But absolutely, in a lot of areas of life, or in our society, in American culture, however you want to say it, a lot of people have just absolutely sacrificed style for comfort. Now, what am I saying? Of course, we all like to be comfortable. Okay, so let's keep this in perspective. But when you go out in public, you don't wear your pajamas. You know what I'm saying? And listen, try something. Now, listen, I know in a few corners I'm speaking to the choir, but for the neophytes, okay? Hey, try something. Next time you go out to the movies, try something cool vintage. Put on a shirt and tie. Put on that sport coat. Distinguish yourself. Carry yourself like a gentleman of distinction. Like a gentleman who cares about the look, the image, the style, the panache that he portrays to the rest of the world. And maybe, just maybe, a few of the guys in the ripped up jeans and 8-year-old flip-flops will pause for just a moment. Maybe. But think about it. This is part of the cool vintage lifestyle. So when you're out in the public, when you're at the restaurant, when you're at the theater, wherever you're going, what a social setting, remember that, and let your presentation reflect that we're not just in an affectation. This is not an affectation. It's a lifestyle. Okay. So we're not talking about just doing decoration on a surface level. We're really talking about the resurrection of a culture. Okay? So these are all things that we will continue to talk about and muse on future shows. So we're done here for another edition of the Dr. William Lester Show. Thank you for joining me. And remember, it's always cool. It's always vintage. And I will see you next time.